Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, well, thank you. Good afternoon, and welcome to the opening of Delilah Montoya, Activating Chicana Resistance. All right, yeah, let's bring it up for that. A retrospective examining Montoya's decades-long art practice, encompassing photography, printmaking, installation art, and activism. The exhibition is guest curated by Dr. Josie Lopez. The exhibition, catalog, and programming are generously supported by a grant from the Terra Foundation for American Art, and is also made possible in part by the City of Albuquerque and the Albuquerque Museum Foundation. Yay! A catalog signing will take place in the museum store, which is just out the door and to your left after this talk. So, introductions to our speakers today. Delilah Montoya is a contemporary Chicana photographer, printmaker, and installation artist based in Albuquerque, where she studied photography at the University of New Mexico. Her work is rooted in the mestiza experience of the Southwest, weaving together a rich tapestry of syncretic forms and practices drawn from Aztec, Spanish, and cross-border traditions. In 2021, Montoya became the first artist to receive the Mellon Foundation's Latinx Artist Fellowship. Yeah, we can clap for that one too. Her work has been featured in solo and group exhibitions worldwide and is included in major public and private collections, including the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and our own Albuquerque Museum, among others. Josie Lopez is an independent art historian and curator. She has published widely and curated numerous exhibitions on art and activism, photography, printmaking, New Mexican, and Chicano art. Before curating this exhibition, she was the co-author and co-curator of Broken Boxes, a decade of art, action, and dialogue. Another, yes, absolutely. The exhibition was on view here at the Albuquerque Museum, where Lopez served as the head curator. So if you all will join me in welcoming Delilah and Josie for today's conversation.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that warm welcome, and to all of you. What an amazing audience. It's great to see so many faces here to celebrate what is truly a local treasure. I wanted to start with just a few thank yous. I really want to thank, I see your mom waving at us, Delilah. I want to thank the museum staff for working so hard to help bring this to fruition. Magali Jimenez Baca and Keith Lee were really instrumental in working with me and Delilah in selecting the work from the very beginning. Keith put a lot of love and care into framing a lot of the works in the exhibition and helping to make sure that the installation is as stunning and beautiful as it could be. Thanks to Alicia Romero, the new head curator here at the Albuquerque Museum. They're really lucky to have you, Alicia. We were also honored and grateful to receive the Terra Foundation grant for this exhibition. We worked directly with the Albuquerque Museum Foundation. Huge thanks to Ginger Hendricks. We have a good batting average, Ginger, so I really appreciate all the hard work that you do to make sure that not only are we getting the funding for these kinds of projects, but that we're getting the recognition of these kinds of national grants. And I'd like to thank City of Albuquerque, Elsa, where are you, Elsa? The museum is so supported by the city. Elsa Menendez and Shel Sanchez, of course, with the help of the mayor, are very good at making sure that the arts are funded and supported in the city of Albuquerque. So thank you for being here. There are so many other scholars and family members and collaborators, and we're not going to be able to thank all of you personally. You know who you are. Thank you for being here, and I think we're going to go ahead and dive in. Before we start talking about the work, I wanted to present a little bit of a roadmap, because Delilah and I, once we get started, we get going. And so I just wanted to, and we're kind of blocking a little bit on the bottom here, but I'll walk you through it. These are really like four, no, Delilah, four specific things that if you look across the body of work that Delilah has done now for decades, she really does these deep dives into these broad-ranging series of works. And oftentimes, she's doing all these things at once. And what's amazing about it is that this is what makes her work activist. It's what gives it its power. It's the way that she approaches her art practice with such intentionality and such a deep understanding that really is what gives the work agency and what allows it to disrupt the way that we see the world and the way that we think about identity, mestizaje, chicanismo, and we're going to get into all of it. But I did want to lay out this roadmap before we jump in. So historical specificity, you're going to see that in her work, she talks about the Chicano movement, layers of colonization, iconic feminine narratives, and spiritual and religious narratives as expressed through cultural practices. She really digs deep into her different mediums, right? A lot of times she's described as a narrative photographer, but she's so much more than that. She is a printmaker. She's a mad scientist. She is constantly experimenting and thinking and pushing the boundaries of the materials that she's working with. She works tirelessly to reveal underlying truths. Which histories are told, who gets to tell them, and most importantly, which histories aren't told and have been disappeared for a really long time. And she's very committed to that process. And then, of course, right now, more than ever, her work reaches into the present. And it really asks about what are our human connections? What are the universal understandings of identity that allow us to connect in ways that are more empathetic and more understanding and more accepting? I wanted to jump into the images kind of right away, Delilah, but I wanted to address something first, because we had an interesting experience last night. It was so beautiful, so beautiful.
Yeah, many of you were there, and I just want to thank you for coming and experiencing this. You know, I've never seen all the work together at once. And so for me, it was like just reviewing those years and years and the things that I was thinking about, and all of a sudden it's just splayed out in front of me, it was just beautiful. And having everybody there was to celebrate it with me it was heartfelt. Thank you for coming. Yes.
Yeah, and it was just really the emotion in the room, the love in that room was just impactful for me as well.
I felt like a lot of people got it.
Yeah.
You got it. You got what it was that I was trying to say. And for me, that was the most important thing, is that there was that understanding. There was pieces in there that resonated with you. You don't have to resonate with everything, but there's one or two things in there that begin to resonate with you. And yeah, thank you, because then I know I'm doing my job, right? I'm doing my job.
Well, we're doing our job in other ways too, because we also had, both of us, an interesting experience of a visitor who expressed strongly their disagreement with the very concept of Chicano identity. And basically asking, why are you doing this kind of work? Why aren't you celebrating the beauty and the pride of your Mexican identity? And normally when I work on an exhibition and someone has very strong feelings, whether they hate it or they love it or they want to argue with me, whatever it is, I think that's awesome. Because it means that all these things are happening, right? We're doing our job. All of this is happening, and we're disrupting the way that people think. And we're asking them to challenge their own assumptions in different ways. But this time it was a little different.
Yeah. Well,
because and I'll let you go on, I'll hand it off. But it was a little different, number one, because it was also my own identity. But what it made me realize is that you have been grappling with this your entire career.
Right.
So I wanted to start off the questions with, could you kind of talk about how important the Chicano movement was for you, not only in thinking about your own place in the world, but also in your trajectory as an artist?
Well, what I've been doing is more or less the roadmap to Chicanismo. It's everything that we were talking about as a group. It was everything that we were thinking about. And for me, what I was doing was unpacking it, right? And it wasn't just like an unpacking it at that one moment, but it's the unpacking throughout the time. Because Chicanismo changed throughout time. It wasn't ever just one thing, but it was many different things. And I think that we were creating our own identity. We were making ourselves, we were remaking ourselves to the era that we were living in and what we were seeing. We were putting on our own lenses and looking out, right? Kind of removing that colonial lens and throwing on our own lens and to see the world that made sense to us. So much of the time through education, through all of these things, the world wasn't making sense. We were having to be like reshaped to meet somebody else's criteria, right? And so what I wanted to do was to really begin to think about who are we? Where did we come from? And just asking these very basic and for me, very critical questions. And I think what was really interesting about, when I was confronted about, well, why aren't you calling yourselves Mexicanos? You're Mexicanos, right? I had to begin to realize, one, she was probably asking herself that question, right? And it was this very need to reaffirm in herself that she was Mexicano, but are we, right? Once you cross that border, once your generations of families have lived in northern New Mexico, have lived in the United States longer than most immigrants, coming from, from Europe, have been here. The land does something to you, right? The spirit of the land becomes part of you. And not to acknowledge that, not to understand those things, right? And so that's that whole thing about reclaiming yourself and reaffirming your identities. I think it begins to come in. Yeah,
and understanding that there's space for all of those identities, right?
Absolutely.
And there's a way that we can understand and, when you look at this exhibit, we talk about it as being a love letter to Albuquerque, but it's also a love letter to Mexico. And
yeah, absolutely.
it really is. And it's understanding how, those components of identity are complex and they're difficult, but they're also a part of all of the ways that we can connect,
right,
rather than try to have to claim some kind of an understanding that our identity is the right one.
Right. Well, then also it's questioning the idea of nationalism, right? So where do we stand in terms of nationalism? And can we not think about ourselves as citizens of the world itself, right? And understand that we all have influence upon each other. In my estimation, this isn't something that I just came up with all of a sudden. It's 35 years, right? 35 years I finally began to realize that we are the colonial body. People that have been in the Americas as long as we have been, we are the colonial body. We're not immigrants, right? And as part of that, as part of being part of that colonial body, we are also global, right? We're not that tribal, really, but we're global because so many of the tribes came together, so many of the peoples came together. So that makes us very global. Just in our DNA, if I was out there, I mean, I did the testing, right? I did the testing to prove it to myself. And what the DNA came back with, we are definitely global. Yeah.
Okay, so we could go on
we could
identity,
go on.
I think, all day. So I do want to jump into the work. But I did want to address that because I wanted to, create an understanding. As I said, I love it when people disagree and because we're doing our job. But I also think that there needs to be a claiming of one's identity in different ways, and you, as you say, have been doing it throughout your career. The exhibition includes 12 different series where Delilah explores a lot of the points that I put up earlier. And so what we're going to do today is just kind of go through some of these series and talk about some of those bullet points with a little bit more of a specificity. So one of the first series that is actually probably my favorite in different ways, but it's the Sagrado Corazon. And this series consisted of something like 36 collotypes, and then also Delilah used different mediums to create different forms that were photographs, and I encourage you to really look at the mediums in the exhibition and compare those. But this was a project, Delilah, that you really collaborated with the community on, and so I'm hoping that you'll share with us a little bit about your process and your thinking behind this particular series. And I have several here that we can kind of talk through and think about together.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Where should I start with this? Well, I was being interviewed at one point, and this young woman said to me, like, "You do a lot of religious work." And then I had to stop and think about it. Am I doing religious work? And I certainly pull those strings, right? Like the Sagrado Corazon, the Guadalupana, all of these. But in my mind, it's like, growing up as a Chicana, growing up with a mother who was from northern New Mexico, the penitentes and religion, Catholicism, it wasn't really Catholicism actually, but those things were like so important to the community. And the community evolved around that, right? And so it just gets ingrained into the culture itself. But what I wanted to do was kind of like explode it a little bit. So where we could begin to understand, well, where did this come from? How does that make us feel about ourselves? Where is our love, right? How do we express ourselves through these very religious icons, right? And so when I came across the Sacred Heart, the first thing that I began to think about was like, it's a disembodied heart. It's a disembodied heart. And up there in the church that we went to, there were these little hearts that were floating around, right? And I'm thinking like, if you put your lenses on, right? Put your lenses on, and your lenses will tell you like, that's a disembodied heart that's floating around. And where did that come from? And and so all of these questions, I had these questions, why are we holding on to this image? Where did that image come from? And then of course, I was taking a lot of Mesoamerican art and all of this, and then I realized with the Nawa society, they had the disembodied heart. And then I began to ask myself the question like, so when did the disembodied heart show up in Catholicism? Because Catholicism is a very ancient religion, right? We're going back couple thousands of years. So at what point did the disembodied heart show up in Catholicism? And what I found when I started researching this, you know, these are things nobody tells you about, right? You just accept the fact that there's a disembodied heart. and it's religious. And so what I found out was that this disembodied heart showed up at the time of the conquest of Mexico. The Franciscans brought it back. Why did they bring it back? And what does that mean? What I began to realize, like, a lot of what the Nahuas were thinking about, and there was beautiful things that they were thinking about in terms of the disembodied heart. It was a point of memory. It was a point of consciousness. It was love. It was like all of these things, and it was the same things that I learned about in the religion that was being taught to me. And then I began to realize, think about the ideas of syncretism. What is cultural syncretism? And then, this is Delilah talking now, it's globalization. We globalized, right, with all of these things. And what it did for us as a people, right, it made us richer. There was more things that we could begin to kind of hold on to that seemed to be lost, but it was not lost, right? So I began to kind of think about it in those ways, and then I began to think about, like, well, what is it now? It is Jesus and it's Mary rebuilding their hearts. And then I thought, well, what about my community? Can my community rebuild their hearts? And so all the portraits that you see, I asked the sitter, would you please reveal your heart to me? And what you see is the different aspects of what they found in their own hearts.
And I just switched our image because I wanted to talk about this one a little bit. This is one of the many collaborators that Delilah has worked with over the years, but also one of the collaborators who she's in conversation with in the catalog. And so, you know, Monica Sanchez, who I think is here, Demetria Martinez is here, Tina Hernandez, I think, is here. These were all conversations that we included in the book because of how important that idea of collaboration is in your work. So I thought maybe we would talk about this one a little bit.
Right. This is Marilena Alvarez. And I don't know, some people here probably know her and they remember her as being the arts editor way back in the day. Way back in the day, she was the arts editor. And I had asked her to sit for me. And when I do that, you know, I want to know what's in their hearts, and I want to collaborate with them to express it properly, right? And so I had asked her, I go, so what is the most impactful for you? What is the thing that really sits inside of your heart? And she told me, my children, right? And so we brought them in as her little angels. And now they're full-grown, you know, with their own children, and yeah. But we can take a look back at this, and we know that it was her children, it was the love for her children that was truly in her heart.
I think the other thing that really spoke to me in the series were just these incredible friendships and the way in which you were reflecting the community's history back to the community in such a beautiful way. And I think, you know, there's Rudolfo Anaya's in there, Eva Encenias is in there, obviously Cecilio Garcia Camarillo's in there, and just having the opportunity, you know, in that moment, which was so special and so creative, you know, to kind of, maybe you can talk a little bit about those connections at that time.
Right. Well, you know, when I look at this image here, I can't help but see that cat. Do you see the cat? And that cat has his nose right on the corner of that frame. And, you know, like, what are the chances of that happening when I snap that picture? I mean, the cat with the corner right, you know, I really love that. And that cat's name is Frida, right? So that was Frida, and I was working with Cecilio. I go, well, all right, Cecilio. So Cecilio was a poet, and he liked to do concrete poetry. And he decided that he was going to just write out one phrase over and over and over again on this huge piece of paper. And I was like, when he brought it, we just kind of put it up on the backdrop. He had Frida with him, and he really wanted a glass, globe. But we didn't have a glass globe, so what we did was we filled a little fishbowl up with water. So it had that kind of look with it. And the phrase is very beautiful. It's, without innocence, how can there be wisdom? And so that's like classic Cecilio. Yeah.
And so there were 36 of these, so we could spend all day, telling those stories. But we do get introduced in this series to your first kind of reckoning with Malinche. And what we see in the exhibit, actually, is you see Malinche 3 different times in this exhibit. The first time was here in the Sagrado Corazon series. The second time you see her is in that second panel there of the Codex.
Yeah, by the way, that's my daughter. Do you remember that? Yeah, she was, yeah. Yeah, we had to make a pact with each other on that. Do you remember the pact that we had to make with that? No, you don't. I asked her to pose for me to be Malinche, right? And she goes, no. So I had to beg her to pose for me to be Malinche, and she said, only if I can have the truck for the weekend. She got the truck for the weekend.
And we can come back and talk about these, but I just wanted to show how you were essentially creating this universe that you call malcriadas, right? Mm-hmm. So then we also see the Malinche in conversation with Sebastiana and also with Lilith at the very end of the show. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you would be willing to walk us through how your vision of the malcriadas grew and shifted over time, and what your lens, was telling you throughout that process.
I think the first time that I began to think about the malcriada was after I finished the imagery of the Guadalupana, and how, for us, she's almost unattainable. She's miraculous, right? And then what I did was I just kind of like moved in the other direction. Then I began to think about like, how is it that, she's so untouchable, but yet within our cultura, we have women that are kind of scorned. And there's the folklore of these women and that are scorned, and they more or less kind of like tell us how we should not be, right? So the first person that I began to kind of, first of course was La Llorona, but I kind of skipped over La Llorona, but I thought about San Sebastiana. And San Sebastiana, I decided to do her first because of her power. She rules life and death. You can't be more powerful than that, right? She's right there at the deathbeds. She can decide when your soul will be taken. And then so I began to think about and I remember a story that my mother told me about Doña Sebastiana, about how God really did not, she really did not want to be death. But God had to convince her to become death, right? And so I began to think about, what was that conversation? What would God say in order to convince her to become death? And because she's a doña, right? And a doña is not going to just be like pushed over. I have doñas in my family, okay? And they are not pushed, they're not pushovers at all, right? So what you'll see with Sebastiana, there's that whole conversation within the video where she is being enticed by God to become death. And what he has to say to her, and what she tells him back. She talks back to God. and Monica, you were like the best Doña Sebastián. She showed up with a shaved head, okay? You know, so what I was trying to do was, with that, and you'll see, is that on one hand I thought, like, Doña Sebastiana doesn't see herself as a calaca. How could she see herself as a calaca? She's a doña, right? So when Doña Sebastiana looks through the mirror, she sees this beautiful woman. But when we look at her, she's a calaca, she's a skeleton, right? And so she never quite figured out why people kept running from her, you know, because, you know, she's so beautiful. You know, so I was just kind of like playing with that idea of her malcriada. I mean, she's the woman who talked to God and told him no. And he had to convince her, right? And yeah, and Monica, you did such a beautiful job with that. It was like, you know, she did just a beautiful job. Thank you. And she's also a malcriada, too. Yeah. So then the next one I began to think about was La Llorona, right? And it was my, at that time, Tina was a student of mine. She was just about ready to graduate. And she went like this with my mind. She just blew my mind. Yeah. And we were having a critique, and she just came right out and she says, well, Adam's first wife was Lilith. And I'm like, no, he wasn't. There was only one wife. Because I was taught there was Adam and there was Eve. Had no idea who Lilith was, right? And then, you know, I was arguing with her, and then I thought, well, let me do a little research, and oh my God. Adam had a wife called Lilith. Right? And so I had to, like, you know, just kind of reinvestigate who Lilith was, and that there was other cultures that understood that Adam had a wife by the name of Lilith, and there was like this falling out, and then Eve was sent down, and all of this. And so I found out that Lilith was a really malcriada. She was really, really bad, right? And then I began to think about the fifth omen of the Aztecs, how they say like La Llorona came from the fifth omen of the Aztecs. But I began to, there we go, another cultural syncretism. I began to realize like La Llorona had both attributes. She had the attributes of Lilith, and she also had the attributes of the fifth omen of the Aztecs. And so what I wanted to do was just kind of like figure out a way of bringing all of that together. And Tina was very good at, you know, let's put a little bit of, you know, be a feminist with it, right? So this would be a good point to talk about women and their bodies, right? And the things that we go through. Because if you think about the story of La Llorona, right? It was because, you know, she was jilted. Right? And there's women that have postpartum depression, and they hurt their babies, and it does happen. And it's really, you know, I'm not going to say that it's their fault, but also our society has to recognize that we have to help them. They need help, right? So, you know, so the idea of the malcriada, right? How we just want to punish them for that. You know, so I was kind of looking at those, I was looking at all of that stuff, and so I think the title says it all. It's La Llorona in Lilith's Garden.
That's beautiful. And I think, you know, a lot of the malcriadas were very much become an iconography for a Chicana identity, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But there was another group of women that you also include in the way that you think about and talk through the malcriadas. And this was actually one of my favorite parts of our collaboration with each other, because I think at this point we had had enough conversation that we were able to be a little bit vulnerable in talking about the way that sometimes our thinking changes, and like what are the things that we go into a project expecting, and then all of a sudden it takes you in a different direction. And the way that you talked about your getting to know the women boxers was really heartwarming to me, and it was a little bit different from the way that you were thinking about Chicanismo in a lot of the work, and this kind of pushed you in a little bit of a different direction.
Yeah, like well, the person that really influenced me was on the, with female boxers was Teresa Marquez, right? Because I knew that she was doing a lot of research with female boxers. As a matter of fact, she was looked upon as being the librarian, the boxing librarian. I mean, there's some pictures of her that she has her boxing gloves on, and she was actually, in the gym, working out, hitting those bags. And she was older when she did that. I would say she was probably hitting close to 50 when she decided that she was just going to start training in boxing. I mean, she was like just an amazing woman. And then when I saw that, I knew her from being here in Albuquerque. And then I began to think about female boxers. There are modern day malcriada, right? They're the ones that they hit each other. Number one, they hit each other, right? And they're jumping into an arena, right, that is male dominated. So, I mean, for me, I was thinking, wow, they really got ganas, just even like decide that they're going to be professional boxers. And, women don't necessarily have that upper body strength, right? They have to really work really hard to get that upper body strength. And they were willing to do this. They wanted to do this. And then I began to think about, like, what boxing was. And like, we know that a lot of barrio boys, they go into boxing, to get off the streets and all of that. There's that whole lore, right? And so I began to think, like, I'm sure it's certainly that's the way it is with the Latinas, with Chicanas, right? They're trying to get off the streets, and they go into the boxing ring and, in the gym and all of that. And so I thought I would find, like, a lot of Chicanas doing this, and I'd be able to kind of, like, follow the family, the coming out of the barrio, okay, total misconception, right? That as I started getting into it, it was not even, like, close to what it was that I was thinking. And at one point, I had to just kind of, like, step back and look at my own prejudices and realize that, I'm going to have to kind of, like, pull some of that stuff away from myself and then open my eyes to see what is really there. And you're probably wondering, well, what did I find there? I found a group of women that were athletes. They were athletes. And what they desired was the combat sport. And they have every right, and they should be given every opportunity to seek that out. And, Teresa was she explained it to me how, like, throughout the years, women had always been boxing. It was nothing new. Women had been in the ring. Women had, taken on the combat sport, but it was always kind of like at a distance. And she was out there finding, like, all of these references to these fights that women were in, boxing fights. And so what I decided that I wanted to start photographing them, and I wanted to photograph them in the arena, right? And I knew that I could do this because early on in my career, I was actually shooting sports. So I knew how to shoot sports, and so I had to just kind of get all that old information that I had. And this was at a time, I was shooting the sports when I didn't have the money for a very good camera, like a sports camera. I really didn't, but I was working for a small town newspaper, and I had to kind of like get the shots. And so here I was with a Nikon, made sure I had a good lens on it. The lenses are always important. You have to have a good lens on a camera. But I had no automatic focus. There was no motor drive. There was none of that. And so what I had to do was learn how to, what they call, pull focus. And so that means that you follow the action as you're moving the focus, right? And so it's just kind of like very intuitive. And I remember it was a 90 millimeter lens, which is not the longest lens that you can have, right? You know, so I would have to like run up into it. And then I'd run back so I could get the shot. And sometimes I'd get knocked. I'd get by the ref, or I'd get knocked out. So, but the point is that I knew how to do this because I got some pretty good shots when I did this, and it was very intuitive. You had to be very intuitive when you were shooting that. Fast forward to I want to shoot women boxers, but I knew I didn't want to do it with the digital camera, and I wanted to use a medium format camera, so that I could get what they call kind of like a resolution that would work really well to blow it up large, right? Real estate, they call it real estate on that negative. So I pulled out my Pentax. I had about a 90 millimeter lens on it, it would be the equivalent of, and I started pulling focus again. And I started shooting by anticipation. I started shooting that by anticipation. And like I showed up, and I knew I had to show up early so that I could get my spot on the skirt. And so I would just show up, believe it or not, I could show up early sometimes. No, and I remember I would just put my elbows on that skirt, and I just put my equipment out like this, and I would just spread out like this so that these guys wouldn't push me out of the way. Because, I'm not quite 5 foot, all right? and these guys with, all this equipment, they would like, she got the best shot in place. And I'm just like, I ain't moving. This is my spot. I'm not moving. And so then I would pull out a film camera that was a medium format film camera, and it was big. And these guys would be looking at me like she does not know what she's doing. And I would only get 20 shots. That's all I could get out of that film camera. So I would get 20 shots. I'd toss that film out, reload it again, and get another 20 shots out of it. And finally, one of the guys came up to me, so what are your pictures looking like? And I was showing them, and he goes, like, what are you doing with these? I go, I'm blowing them up. I'm getting them really big. I'm digitizing them. They're going to go into a museum. They're going, all of these things, right? And they're looking at me like, she is really crazy. Yeah. So, okay, so I was being malcriada, right? I was being malcriada doing that. And so back to what did I find out? What did I learn? I learned, when I walked away from that project, I learned that gender is fluid. That was the one thing I found out, that I was completely, even, the idea of woman who is a woman, right, has to be rethought about. So I had to rethink that. I also had to rethink that, like, women who are, who go into boxing, it's not all Latinas, right? There's women from all across the globe going into female boxing. So it's not particular to any one group. But what it was particular was these women who identified as women had the strength and the courage to go into that arena. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I want to switch gears a little bit. There are two series in this exhibition in particular that are directly thinking about, talking about, engaging with the US-Mexico border and immigration and detention and incarceration. I want to thank Diana Delgado, who worked on an interactive space that you'll see at the very end of the exhibition, where people can actually read letters from the Torrance County Detention Center and also write letters to people who are currently incarcerated. So I'd just like to invite you all to engage with that space in some way, and just to, at least to bear witness to what is currently happening. But Delilah, you, and in collaboration with Orlando Lara and Sinuelos, you know, created these projects and were bearing witness back at a time when it was kind of the beginnings of when those detention centers started popping up in a really profound way. So I'm hoping that you'll walk us through these two projects a little bit.
Yeah, certainly. Sid, the Trail of Thirst, came around because I had done a lecture over at Stanford, and this young man came up to me and told me he was from Houston, and, you know, gave him my email and said, yeah, look me up, all of this, and he did. And his name was Orlando Lara, and he says, I want to make Chicanx art. I want to make art, he tells me. I go, and I knew it was at Stanford, so I know that he had done some sort of research. I go, so what was your research? What were you researching? He goes, the US-Mexican border. And I'm like, oh, that's great. And so much of the research that we see here is Orlando's research, right? And I was just more or less giving him a platform. I was kind of like showing him how to kind of like rethink about this in a very creative way. And as we were talking about what was going on at that time, and this is work that was done in 2005 and 2006. This is way before people, what we see right now. And I was very interested. I remember I had another student who was, he was Mormon, and he was photographing the Mormon trails, right? And then when I began to think about, like, wait a minute, we have our trails. We have our trails that are very ancient and probably older than any of the Mormon trails. And has anybody ever, like, followed those trails? And so one of the contemporary trails that were out there were the migrant trails. And where were they going? And how were they crossing? And why were they crossing at the points that were being crossed, right? And, you know, I knowing that how fluid the southern border has always been, I know that those trails are ancient. Those are ancient trails that they were going up. So what we did was that we decided that we were going to follow those trails, and we were going to photograph that trail to see what was on it. Because I also thought about Amalia Mesa Baines. She wrote about how the land has a memory. And the things that are on the land are the scars that we have placed on the land itself. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to explore those scars that were on the land. And so what you're seeing is you're seeing the things, the debris and such that were dropped. And, you know, some of that debris, what we were picking up were, and we saw were like backpacks and the shoes, and we were seeing like muscle relaxers, and we were seeing water bottles, and we were seeing all these things that they were using to get them across that land in Arizona. Arizona is a tough one because there's no water, right? And a lot of the population that was coming across that were trying to reconnect with their families, right? For education, for jobs, for, you know, all the reasons that we have, that we try to exist with, right? What we were doing was just kind of like photographing those scars and such. Okay, so Detention Nation came on the heels of Sid Trail of Thirst. And it was at a time at the Station Museum, James Harris knew that I had done that project with Sid, Trail of Thirst, because that's where it showed. It showed first in Houston. And he had asked me, in 2015, there was this time when we knew that all these children were being placed into a detention center, and he was like, where are they going? What are they doing with these children, right? And then he comes to me and he says, can you put together an installation based on that? And I knew Orlando Lara had gone into the detention centers, and he had been exploring what was going on within the detention centers. And they wanted this whole thing done in like 2 months. 2 months. And I'm like,
We worked on this for 3 years, just to give you context.
and I was like, I felt like we really had to explore this. I felt like that we really had that moment where we could talk about this. And it was at that point, Orlando and I got together and says, we can't do this by ourselves. We need more people. And so we were able to reach out to artists, we were able to reach out to other activists, and when we did this, we thought, well, we have to give ourselves a name. And our name was Sin Huellas, without fingerprints, right? Yeah. And so through all of our activism, all of our contacts, all of our ideas, just sitting there kind of talking to each other, and going to James Harris as like, now you've got to up the money, right? You got to give us the resources, because we can't get our resources too. We were able to put together the installation of Detention Nation, and that was a name as a collective that we decided to name that installation. And I remember when it first opened up in Houston at the Station Museum, people walked in, and what we wanted to do was kind of give them the experience of what it was like inside of a detention center, because nobody knew what that was like. They would not let, as they do today, they do not let anybody in. And so what we did was we started interviewing people coming out. What was it like? What were you seeing? What were they doing? And so we put all of those little pieces together within the museum. And when people started walking through this, they refused to believe that the United States was doing this. This is not happening. This is not happening in the United States. And we go, yes, it's down the street. They have one of the largest detention centers in the United States in Houston. And it was like, it was just kind of like they were having a hard time believing that we could do this to another population. And that was in 2015. And now it has exploded. There's more detention centers. There's more people being dislocated. Part of me is like, what happens to all of their resources once they dislocate them? Where do the resources go? What happens to their bank account? What happens to all the things that are in their homes when they're just grabbed and like that? Right? Yeah. So, yeah, that's how it started. And we were able to show it every year for about 5 years in different locations. And then at one point, the pandemic came, and nobody was showing anything anymore. So we decided, like, what we'll do is we'll put it all up online, which we have, and it's called detentionnation.com. And so you can see all the installation, all the work, the letters, everything is up there online. There's videos, yeah.
So our time is up.
Okay.
I don't know, Elizabeth, if we don't have time for questions. Okay. I want to just end. I know it's hard to be so hopeful in a moment when there's so much happening that is so hateful. But the title of this really beautiful landscape is Road to Aztlán. And it kind of brings us back full circle to where we started, which was talking about the Chicano movement and the importance of that movement in your trajectory as an artist, but also thinking about how Aztlán was a way for Chicanos to imagine, right? A different future, a different way to have our own solidarity, our own name for ourselves, our own connections as communities. And no doubt that there are different Chicanismos in different places, but it was finally a way to start thinking about that kind of imaginary. So maybe that's the place where we can find some hope.
Well, it's the dream, right? Yeah, it's the dream. We also have our dream. Thank you.
So we're going to ask Delilah and Josie to go over the bookstore so we can do some catalog signing, and you all can meet them over there. Thanks so much.